In the often heated world of political debate, tone can determine more than the argument itself. It can shape how people perceive the character behind the words. When JD Vance addressed Jasmine Crockett that morning, his delivery was sharp, deliberate, and authoritative. He had built a reputation for being articulate and unafraid to challenge opponents directly, often exposing what he viewed as flaws in reasoning or policy. So when he leaned in and told Crockett that her comments made her unfit to lecture anyone about governance, it was clear he wanted to establish control of the conversation. It wasn't an outburst or an insult hurled in anger. It was calculated. Phrased in the precise way, a senator who understands optics would use a critique meant to sound professional but sting personally. Asterisk. The room felt the shift immediately. Even though Vance's tone wasn't loud or aggressive, the implication was clear. He was questioning not just Crockett's ideas, but her capability to lead, to contribute meaningfully in the political space. Many expected the exchange to escalate, that Crockett, known for her outspoken defense of her principles, would fire back in equal measure, but she didn't. Instead, she paused, almost letting the tension breathe, as if she was giving everyone, including Vance, a moment to feel the weight of what had been said. Asterisk. That silence became a turning point. Asterisk. When she finally spoke, her voice was not raised. There was no sarcasm, no visible anger. Instead, she spoke with a kind of composure that disarms rather than provokes. She acknowledged Vance's point without agreeing with it, shifting the energy of the moment from confrontation to conversation. Her calm tone underlined something important, that strength doesn't always have to be loud, and clarity doesn't always need to compete with volume. Asterisk. Observers later noted how JD Vance himself seemed to listen carefully as she responded. He didn't interrupt her or counter immediately. It was as if the quiet authority in her voice had momentarily reset the atmosphere. She spoke not like someone defending herself, but like someone offering perspective. That shift from defensive to reflective was what made the interaction so memorable. Asterisk. Vance, despite his initial criticism, seemed to recognize that Crockett's restraint wasn't weakness. It was discipline. While his statement had sought to challenge her fitness for leadership, her reaction demonstrated precisely why she belonged there. She showed she could absorb pressure without letting it dictate her tone. In political arenas, where words often spiral into noise, that kind of control stands out. Asterisk. Tone, in this sense, became the bridge between disagreement and dignity. JD Vance had framed the conversation around credibility. Crockett reframed it around empathy and respect. By refusing to mirror his sharpness, she forced the room, and him, to engage differently. It's easy to argue over policies and labels, but much harder to argue against composure. Her poise revealed that true leadership sometimes lies in how one responds when challenged. Asterisk. For Vance, whose style tends to rely on confident assertion and moral clarity, the moment may have served as an unexpected reflection. His critique of her understanding of fiscal matters was rooted in his belief in disciplined governance and conservative responsibility, principles he often articulates with conviction. But when faced with Crockett's.com response, it became clear that tone could influence perception as much as content. Even those who agreed with his argument noticed how her measured words softened the space and redirected the focus from confrontation to communication. Asterisk. What unfolded in that room wasn't about who was right or wrong. It became an illustration of how temperament can reshape the dynamic of power. JD Vance's words carried authority, but Jasmine Crockett's response carried weight. Authority demands attention. Composure earns respect. And in that subtle difference, she shifted the balance of the exchange. Asterisk. Political debates often reward volume, but in this moment, it was restraint that commanded the room. Vance's challenge might have sparked defensiveness in another setting, but Crockett's tone turned it into a chance for reflection. Her calmness didn't silence her opponent, it invited him to listen. And that, more than any sharp retort, left a lasting impression on everyone present. Asterisk. When JD Vance told Jasmine Crockett that her comments made her unfit to lecture anyone about governance, it wasn't just a critique of her perspective, it was a challenge to her credibility. In politics, words like unfit carry a sharp undertone. They suggest inadequacy, a lack of seriousness, a failure to meet the standard of leadership. For many, that kind of statement might trigger defensiveness or outrage, especially in a public setting where every facial expression is scrutinized. But Crockett chose a different path. She didn't reject the word outright or retaliate with an insult of her own. Instead, she took the criticism, examined it, and redefined it in a way that shifted the entire conversation. Asterisk. Her approach was thoughtful and precise. Rather than taking Vance's accusation at face value, she turned unfit into an opportunity to highlight what she stood for. She calmly began by speaking about her background, growing up in communities that struggled not because they were reckless, but because they were overlooked by systems of power. Her tone was steady, her words deliberate. She explained that she entered public service not out of ambition, but out of empathy. By grounding her response in experience rather than emotion, she reframed the meaning of fitness itself. Asterisk. JD Vance had intended his statement to underline what he viewed as a lack of understanding in her fiscal stance. From his perspective, governance required discipline, restraint, and respect for institutional structure, qualities he often associated with conservative principles. When he called her unfit, it wasn't said in hostility, but with conviction, as though he were holding her to a standard he believed essential for leadership. However, Crockett's reframing revealed that fitness in public service is not only about intellect or policy expertise. It's also about empathy, lived experience, and the courage to represent voices often left unheard. By doing this, she didn't directly challenge JD Vance's authority or credentials. Instead, she broadened the definition of what qualifies someone to speak on governance. Her words carried the quiet implication that leadership is not the exclusive domain of those who fit a certain mold. It belongs equally to those who have seen hardship, who understand the consequences of policy from the ground level. That redefinition shifted the audience's focus suddenly. The conversation wasn't about who was more technically knowledgeable, but about who understood the human cost behind political decisions. For a moment, even Vance seemed to pause. He had entered the exchange prepared to debate numbers and accountability, perhaps expecting Crockett to counter with fiery rhetoric. Instead, she humanized the issue, reminding everyone in the room that governance isn't just a matter of fiscal charts and balance sheets, it's about people. Her choice not to fight his assertion, but to reinterpret it, disarmed the tension. There was something quietly strategic about her approach. By accepting the word unfit and then reshaping it, she took control of the narrative without appearing combative. It was an inversion of power. What began as a critique ended up becoming her platform. She showed that being called unfit could actually be a badge of honor if it meant prioritizing compassion over calculation. The audience responded not to a defense, but to a redefinition, a reframing that challenged the very assumptions behind Vance's statement. JD Vance, known for his sharp intellect and quick wit, had confronted many political opponents before. He was used to sparring with people who met his assertiveness with equal force. But Crockett's response wasn't forceful. It was reflective. And in that reflection, she exposed the deeper truth that politics often forgets, that criticism doesn't have to be absorbed or repelled. It can be transformed. Her ability to do that demonstrated a kind of emotional intelligence that is often undervalued in political discourse. The exchange didn't make Vance appear malicious or unreasonable. Rather, it highlighted a contrast in how both leaders viewed service. For him, leadership was about discipline and order. For her, it was about empathy and inclusion. Both saw themselves as fit in different ways. But by reframing his critique, Crockett reminded everyone watching that the true measure of fitness isn't about aligning with ideology. It's about connecting with humanity. Her composure and thoughtful reframing showed a deep understanding of political dialogue. She didn't try to win the argument by proving JD Vance wrong. She aimed to expand the meaning of what they were discussing. It was a masterclass in turning confrontation into reflection, and in doing so, she managed to transform a personal critique into a collective moment of reconsideration about what leadership really means. When Jasmine Crockett responded to JD Vance's criticism, she did more than defend herself. She redirected the conversation toward the deeper purpose of public service. Her words weren't crafted to sting or score political points. They were grounded in a message of service that reached beyond party lines. In a setting where politicians often compete for the sharpest soundbite, Crockett's response stood out for its sincerity. She reminded everyone in the room, including Vance himself, that the role of leadership isn't to dominate, but to serve. JD Vance had challenged her understanding of governance, suggesting that her statements on fiscal matters revealed a lack of discipline and made her unfit to lead serious policy discussions. From his perspective, governance required precision, responsibility, and a willingness to make difficult, sometimes unpopular, decisions, all principles that aligned with his view of conservative leadership. He saw his critique as a defense of standards, a necessary pushback against what he considered loose political rhetoric. But Crockett's answer reframed that idea of service entirely. She began by acknowledging the disconnect between what politicians discuss in chambers and what ordinary citizens experience in their daily lives. Her words carried no hostility, only truth. The people who sent us here, she said softly, didn't send us to insult one another. They sent us to serve. That simple line reshaped the energy in the room. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about whether she understood policy nuances better than JD Vance, but whether the system itself had lost sight of why it existed in the first place. It was a reminder that resonated even with those who disagreed with her politics. Crockett's focus on the mission of representation stripped away the usual layers of partisanship that often cloud Washington discussions. She wasn't speaking to win an argument. She was speaking to realign values. Vance, who is known for emphasizing responsibility and discipline, appeared to recognize that her message touched something fundamental. Both of them, in their own ways, believed in service. They simply defined it differently. For Vance, service often means protecting the stability and traditions that have sustained American governance. His speeches and writings frequently underline the need for structure, accountability, and a strong moral foundation. To him, Effective service requires a balance between compassion and caution, a careful stewardship of resources and power. Crockett's view, expressed through her response, leaned toward a more personal and empathetic form of service, one that measures success not in efficiency, but in impact. She spoke about those who live without privilege, the communities that feel unheard, and how leadership should be defined by its ability to bridge those divides. In that moment, her message transcended ideology. It wasn't just a rebuttal to JD Vance. It was a reminder to everyone in that courtroom, and perhaps to the broader political world, that service means listening before leading. Even those who entered the room expecting a heated confrontation found themselves reflecting on the simplicity of her words. The pause that followed her statement wasn't one of tension, but of realization. JD Vance, sitting across from her, didn't interrupt. His silence was notable. It wasn't the silence of dismissal, but of acknowledgement. He had started the exchange by questioning her understanding of governance, but her response illuminated something he could respect: conviction rooted in empathy. For all their differences, that common ground between purpose and duty subtly united them, if only for a moment. Crockett's insistence on the people's voice, not as a talking point, but as a compass, turned what could have been another political clash into an unexpected moment of reflection. Her calm, yet firm reminder that they were elected to serve, not to spar, seemed to soften even the most skeptical listeners. The line wasn't delivered with grandeur. It was spoken plainly, as if she were stating something everyone already knew, but had forgotten to practice. What made her message powerful was its humility. By emphasizing service over ego, Crockett didn't elevate herself. She elevated the principle of governance itself. JD Vance's challenge, intended to expose her weaknesses, instead helped reveal the moral clarity in her approach. It became evident that public service, at its best, isn't about who argues more effectively, but who remembers why they're arguing in the first place. Her focus on serving the people, those without influence, those often overlooked, resonated because it was genuine. In that courtroom surrounded by cameras and critics, she didn't perform for applause. She simply reminded everyone, including JD Vance, that leadership without empathy becomes hollow. And for a brief moment, the weight of that truth silenced the noise of politics. The power of composure often goes unnoticed in politics, where passion and confrontation tend to dominate public exchanges. But during the tense courtroom hearing between JD Vance and Jasmine Crockett, composure became the quiet force that carried the most impact. It wasn't the volume of their words that mattered, it was how they were delivered. When Vance challenged Crockett, suggesting that her statements made her unfit to discuss governance, the room expected the usual reaction: pushback, defensiveness, perhaps even anger. Yet Crockett's restraint changed the entire tone. By staying calm, she shifted control of the moment without ever raising her voice. JD Vance's words were sharp but measured. He didn't yell or insult her directly. Instead, his phrasing carried authority, the kind that commands attention in political spaces. Vance is known for his precision, for articulating his beliefs with clarity and strength. When he called her unfit, he likely saw it as a critique of policy understanding, not a personal attack. But to the room, it landed as something deeper. Everyone felt the tension ripple through the space, waiting for the exchange to turn heated. Crockett, however, did something unexpected. She took a slow breath, looked directly at him, and responded with calm clarity. Her choice to remain composed didn't just diffuse the tension, it redefined it. The stillness in her demeanor contrasted sharply with the charged energy of the accusation. Instead of meeting intensity with intensity, she met it with grace. That decision didn't make her seem passive. It made her powerful. It's easy to argue loudly, to meet fire with fire, but it takes far more strength to hold steady in the face of provocation. Her tone was firm, deliberate, and grounded. And in that moment, the room, which had been leaning toward confrontation, began to listen instead of react. JD Vance, who was no stranger to heated debates, seemed momentarily disarmed by her composure. He listened as she spoke, not out of obligation, but because her calm delivery commanded respect. Her voice carried no bitterness, only conviction. "If unfit means speaking for those who can't afford lobbyists," she said, "then I'll wear that word proudly." That single line, delivered softly but confidently, landed with far greater impact than any sharp retort could have. The entire courtroom seemed to take note. It was a reminder that influence doesn't always come from dominance, but from discipline. In many ways, Crockett's composure revealed what true strength looks like in leadership, while JD Vance represented a forceful kind of conviction rooted in logic, order, and principle. Crockett embodied another kind, one that balanced intellect with empathy. She didn't allow his statement to define her. She reframed it with dignity. The contrast between their styles made the moment resonate even more deeply. His authority was structural, hers was emotional, and together, they created a moment that transcended politics, showing two versions of leadership in one frame. one commanding through power, the other through poise. Observers later noted how the atmosphere in the room changed after her response. The tension that had hung thick in the air seemed to dissipate. Even those who supported JD Vance recognized the weight of her composure. It wasn't a performance, it was authentic self-control, the kind that can't be rehearsed. Her calmness forced reflection rather than reaction, and that's why the clip spread beyond the usual circles of political commentary. People weren't sharing it for drama. They were sharing it because it reminded them what respect and restraint look like in public service. JD Vance himself, known for his confidence and rhetorical sharpness, appeared to acknowledge the significance of her response. He didn't counter immediately. For a brief moment, he sat back and listened. It wasn't that he had been defeated, it was that he had been met with something equally powerful, something that couldn't be debated, composure rooted in conviction. Even for someone as seasoned as Vance, it was a reminder that the way a person carries themselves can influence the meaning of a moment, just as much as the words themselves. In that sense, Crockett's restraint didn't silence her opponent. It elevated the conversation. Her self-control gave her words credibility and emotional depth. Rather than trying to win the exchange, she demonstrated the strength to stay grounded when it would have been easier to react. That kind of composure is rare, not because it's difficult to achieve, but because it requires an inner stillness that many overlook in the heat of confrontation. For JD Vance, who has built his career on strong, clear articulation of principle. Facing that kind of quiet conviction may have been unexpected, yet it revealed something he likely respects, that leadership isn't defined by who speaks the loudest, but by who remains steady when others lose balance. Crockett's.com response reminded everyone that authenticity and discipline are forms of power too, and sometimes, they're the ones that echo longest after the words themselves have faded. As the hearing drew to a close, there was no triumphant declaration, no dramatic exit, and no lingering argument between JD Vance and Jasmine Crockett. The cameras kept rolling, but the energy in the room had shifted from confrontation to contemplation. What began as a pointed exchange between two political figures evolved into something more meaningful, a reminder that leadership, at its best, is less about defeating opponents and more about defining oneself through integrity. JD Vance had entered the discussion with confidence, ready to challenge what he saw as misplaced priorities in governance. His directness reflected the discipline and conviction that have long shaped his public image. He believed in holding leaders accountable, in ensuring that those who speak on policy do so with precision and understanding. His words, though sharp, came from a place of principle, from the belief that governance requires both intellect and restraint. Yet, Jasmine Crockett's response introduced another kind of strength, one that doesn't seek to overpower, but to elevate. She reminded everyone watching that leadership isn't always measured by control, but by composure. Her calm defiance didn't reject JD Vance's challenge. By staying grounded and respectful, she showed that disagreement doesn't have to breed hostility. Her words reflected not just political belief, but emotional intelligence, the capacity to turn criticism into connection. What made the moment resonate was not the clash of ideologies, but the clarity of values. Vance stood for structure, accountability, and fiscal order. Crockett stood for empathy, representation, and service. Their exchange revealed two essential dimensions of leadership that, when combined, create balance, logic, and compassion. Neither tone nor temperament alone defines a true public servant. It's the harmony between conviction and humanity that does. The clip of their interaction soon spread far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Commentators from both sides of the aisle shared it, not because it was controversial, but because it was refreshingly civil. In a political climate often defined by chaos and confrontation, the composure displayed by both figures offered something rare: perspective. It showed that even strong disagreements can unfold with dignity, that listening can be as powerful as speaking, and that restraint can sometimes communicate more than rhetoric ever could. For JD Vance, the moment reinforced that passion and principle must coexist with humility. For Jasmine Crockett, it proved that authenticity and grace can stand firm against even the most pointed critiques. Both walked away having made their points, but the true takeaway wasn't who won, it was how they handled the weight of their words. In the end, the encounter stood as a quiet testament to what leadership could look like if more people remembered the power of composure, empathy, and purpose. The courtroom may have emptied, but the message lingered that respect and reason, when paired with conviction, still have the power to shock a world that has grown